Welcome to Reach, your platform to connect with other executive assistants and acquire game-changing knowledge and perspective. Reach is designed to inspire your workday, guide you through pivotal moments in your career, and transform you into the executive assistant you've always wanted to be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Reach. This is your host, Jessica Van. I'm the founder and CEO of Maven Recruiting Group, and I have a guest that I am delighted to honor to our program today and welcome. She is none other than Ann Hyatt. Ann has supported many of the titans of tech whose names are household names and widely recognized within the business world and broader business community. Those names include people such as Jeff Bezos, founder and CEO of Amazon, Marissa Mayer, former CEO of Yahoo, and Eric Schmidt, CEO and executive chairman of Google. Just one of those names, Ann, would be impressive, but the fact that you've worked in close proximity with all three of them there's no other word that comes to mind other than legendary. Having pivoted her career as an executive business partner, Ann is now a leadership strategist and executive coach, as well as an author and a podcaster. We'll be linking to her book, which is called Bet on Yourself, Recognize, Own, and Implement Breakthrough Opportunities in our show notes for this episode. Ann has been featured in Forbes, in Business Insider, and even the Harvard Business Review for her notable work experience. And she is a frequent keynote speaker and panelist on the global business circuit. Today, she's going to be sharing some of the wisdom that she's gleaned from working closely with some of the most legendary and brightest minds in Silicon Valley, and how she has parlayed that knowledge into her work as an executive leadership strategist today. So I think with that introduction, everyone can understand why I am understandably delighted to have you and really, really looking forward to everything that you are going to be sharing with us over the next hour. So thank you again.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Jessica.
It seems like you started your career at the top, and even in listening to some of your footage, you mentioned that working for Jeff Bezos was your first role, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell us more about your origin story and how you landed in such distinguished positions?
Yeah, this story doesn't make sense. It's true. So I came into tech very unintentionally. And yes, my very first job after undergrad was working directly for Jeff Bezos at 20 years old. I'd never had that type of job before. I'd been like a receptionist, and I worked at the European Union Center on campus while studying full-time during undergrad. But yeah, I'd never had a job like this. And to be fair to me, nobody really ever had, because what we did together during those foundational years of Amazon was a unique moment in time that had never happened before and will never happen again. And I was really there for the rocket ship acceleration period of their initial growth. It was a true master class in risk-taking and innovation and creativity and problem solving and beating all the odds. Yeah, that was my first job. So it took me actually 9 months to get hired. And that was for a couple of reasons, probably 3 reasons. One was it was a really weird time in the economy. So I grew up in Seattle. I studied at University of Washington for undergrad, and we had just experienced the dot-com bust. I graduated from undergrad in 2002, so the entire economy of Seattle had disappeared within the year before I graduated. So it was really hard to get a phone call back anywhere because no one was hiring. The few people that did were swamped. And then also it was a long interview process because Amazon correctly assessed that the most important decisions they were making were the people that they hired. And so the bar to get in was decidedly very high and remained so for a very long time. And the third thing was I was considered for a role where I would be sitting literally physically closest to Jeff Bezos than anyone in the entire organization. We were 3 feet apart for pretty much 18 hours a day for the 3 years that I worked for him. So Jeff is a big defender of who gets to be in that space and part of his creative process.
Understandably. Did you even know what an assistant did at the age of 20 years old?
I mean, I thought I did, but what I ended up doing for him was beyond what I imagined would be encompassed in that role. And honestly, it really quickly bled out way beyond the traditional confines of that job description. I don't even know what to call what I did. I did executive problem solving. I did everything from like new category launches to helping create his first TED Talk that he ever gave back before anyone had really even heard of TED Talks. Like it was a huge role. I just did anything and everything that he possibly needed. But the only way I really survived in that is because I had an incredible team manager named John Connors who supported Jeff Bezos for 19 years. And he gave me my original playbooks and taught me everything I needed to know in those foundational years.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, that could be an entire book unto itself of just that experience, like that hyper growth, hyper exposure. You mentioned in a piece for Forbes that you specifically wanted to work for Eric Schmidt, that you chose him very intentionally after observing his management style. What was it about his leadership approach that resonated with you and that you felt you could really learn from?
Well, he chose me, to be fair. He recruited me to his office, but I said yes to the opportunity because I had really admired his leadership style for a long time. So I worked at Google for 12 years, but the first 3 years I was there, I worked for Marissa Mayer on the product team, and I watched the way that he ran the company as CEO, which was really completely unique to any other executive I've ever seen because his role was very, very unique. He had been hired by Larry and Sergey, Google's co-founders, to come in because of his professional experience, having been CEO of major tech organizations before. He had been CEO of Sun and Novell. Both companies went through enormous moments of trial while he was CEO, and he had been stress tested, and he had the playbooks that they needed yesterday. They were inventing the future and they didn't have time to kind of figure out how to run the day to day. And so they rightfully identified that it would be better to bring in someone external. So I really admired the way that he served them. I think if I was to describe his leadership style, it would be humble leadership. He didn't forget that it wasn't his company. He was completely committed to their vision and whatever the goals were that they had for what they wanted to do. And he was there to offer professional guidance, to help them in times of incredible risk-taking and to really provide that compass for these young executives who, started Google in their dorm room at Stanford at 25 years old. So I really admired the way that he ran a meeting, handled conflict, led us through times of ambiguity and incredible stress. I mean, Google wasn't the first search engine. It was the 22nd, I think. And when I joined, it wasn't yet the dominant search engine. Just like when I was at Amazon, it wasn't yet profitable. So I was there for some really foundational years of building up the strategy and the playbooks for how we were going to be successful. And I really admired how Eric Schmidt did that. And it was such a privilege to work directly for him for 9.5 of the 12 years I was at Google.
It's incredible. You mentioned in some footage that I saw earlier about how he ran meetings, and you mentioned that he would often take more of a professorial role and really, that of listener, and kind of would steer and guide the conversation and allow a healthy amount of dissension to occur, and which is also something that I understand Jeff Bezos encouraged is a healthy amount of dissension and challenge from his broader or from his inner circle. But the way that he structured these meetings to encourage that, and then to really, what I heard you say was that he would really parse the information and say, okay, this is what I've heard, this is what I'm getting. If I were to, capture the takeaways, these are the options, these are the challenges, these are the risks. How do we want to go forward? Is that an accurate summary of how he ran meetings? And is that something that, that you've then taken into how you conduct and structure your own meetings?
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate summary. So I hear three questions in one. One was, this is, yes, a common denominator between highly effective leaders that I've worked for and now work with. Jeff Bezos and Eric, and really Marissa, also not only tolerated, but demanded that their teams be very, very vocal if they had concerns, if they had new ideas, even if they were disruptive observations or ideas of something that might cannibalize something that was working now in service of something that would be more effective down the line. They leaned into those opportunities for incremental improvement in a way that I think many young leaders find threatening or worrisome. So yeah, I definitely have often described Eric's leadership style as professorial because he kind of leans back and he's so deeply and intently listening, and he spends most of his time asking questions to help accelerate the decision making in the room, to bring out new perspectives. He has this habit that's a little bit terrifying if it's your first time in a meeting with Eric, where he will call on the quietest person in the room, which is almost always the junior most person in the room, because the person who's being quiet is probably being more reflective than those who are, more inclined to just enjoy hearing themselves speak and just kind of say whatever comes into their mind first. He likes to gather the thoughts of those who have been more contemplative. And that leads into the third part of your question, which is really around the structure. How do they structure once you've got the right people in the right seats around the table, which in and of itself is an art that I work with my CEO consulting clients on. Once we have that, how do we structure the time to make sure that our decision making is going to be as effective and efficient as possible? And what I really watched from Eric, and I replicated when I was running meetings within Google and now beyond with my clients, is really centering your executive time around debate. So I call them the 3 Ds. These are kind of the 3 different categories of things that are on your meeting agendas. You want to be spending most of your time in the first D, which is debate. This is where we're faced with a big challenge where we're not choosing between good and bad and black and white. We're choosing between 3 unknown paths forward. Each of them have some pros and cons, and we just don't know which is going to pay off. That's where you want to be spending most of your face-to-face time. What I see instead, most executive team meetings is they're just giving what I call weather reports. That's not helpful at all. That should be an email, ideally a dashboard. You don't need to sit around a table and read that to each other. So I think Eric did that exceptionally well, where we were structured around what are the most critical decision points we need. And then we also did something that's the inverse of how most executives spend their time, which is you were expected to spend probably double the amount of time preparing for a meeting than you did in the meeting. And that means that you are thinking deeply about the problem, you're gathering data, you're being very creative and innovative and thinking about multiple approaches and the pros and cons of each of them. And you present this in what I called the packet. And the packet is where everyone submits their arguments, their data, their proposals in advance so that they can be peer reviewed. And we get the deeper reactions of people who've had ideally at least 24 hours to kind of think about that and come with some informed questions, opinions, research, data, whatever it is to help accelerate our decision making and make our big bets more likely to be accurate. And then the last part of answering that question, I think I'll say, is Eric did something exceptional that's also rare, where he treated these decisions more like experiments. It's very rare that these types of, if you're doing something innovative or creative, it's very rare that that's what Jeff Bezos calls a one-way door. Jeff always framed this as one-way doors versus two-way doors. If it's a two-way door, where if we go through this door and we're like, whoops, that actually wasn't it, I want door number 2, you can come right back. You optimize for speed. Almost all of your decisions are two-way doors, where just optimize for speed, go really fast, and then set up what I call red light or green light indicators of the things that you expect to see on the other side of that door that tells you if this was a good choice or if you need to pivot, go back and try a different door. So I think that attitude of experimentation and active debate and listening and gathering as many data points and diverse voices and opinions is really why I describe his methodology as very professorial.
Mm-hmm. Which it's interesting too, because you obviously, pursued a PhD in philosophy, and a lot of what I'm hearing in the emphasis around debate and dialogue and discussion and healthy dissension is I think, a lot of the principles of the Socratic method and asking intelligent questions and just probing, right, in general. And I think it's really, I mean, one, it's like the most archival and classic way of encouraging healthy insights and discussion, right? It's like the oldest form. But at the same time, I think that really just underscoring its relevance in the modern discussion room, the modern meeting room, the modern boardroom, that these are really vital and energizing types of ways of engaging. And I think it's just a really healthy reminder about how to construct teams, how to structure healthy discussion, and the importance of dissension, the importance of diversity of thought. I think it's just a nice reminder, an important one to consider in how you assemble teams.
I couldn't agree more. Just a quick aside, my PhD was not in philosophy. The internet has lied to you. I hear that all the time.
No.
It was actually it's not the first time I've heard it. It was in international studies. So that's what I was studying in graduate school. But you're absolutely right that the most important thing that I learned in my PhD program was the joy of asking like 1,000 more layers of questions than a normal person would. Mm-hmm. And that prepared me for my time at Google and my time now as a consultant in ways I never would have anticipated. Really leaning into the discomfort of the unknown, of getting outside the confines of your area of expertise and really highlighting that rather than trying to hide it, which is our natural instinct. Mm-hmm. Jeff did this also very purposely in two ways that I'd like to share. The first is what is semi-famous, called the 6-page memo, which was very similar to that, like write everything in advance. You would literally have to submit a 6-page report to defend the meeting that you have, where everyone would read it in advance. When you sit down in a meeting at Amazon, even to today, 22 years later, you spend the first 20 minutes reading that 6-page memo, even though you read it in preparation. Everyone sits there silently and reads it so that it's fresh in our minds and we can have an active debate. The second way that Jeff encouraged this was the year that I joined his team, 2002, he created a brand new role. And this role was called the Shadow. And the very first shadow ever was Andy Jassy, who is becoming a household name because 19 years later, he became Jeff Bezos' successor as CEO. That's how long the training program was. But the Shadow was a rotational role for a very talented young executive to come in and literally be at Jeff's side in everything, copied on every email, in every meeting, on every flight, everything. And at first, they're just there to absorb the massive amounts of information that Jeff has to process every day, but also to anticipate the questions he's going to ask, follow his leadership style, the way he would make decisions so that they can replicate that when he no longer can be in rooms where critical decisions are being made. So Andy famously, after his role as Shadow, went on to run this seemingly crazy thing that became Amazon Web Services, a multi-billion-dollar subsidiary of Amazon, which is another story. But the role of the Shadow, one was to be kind of that sounding board and have the full context, whereas all of Jeff's other SVPs were heads down in their own deliverables. This role could be cross-functional, just like he was. But most importantly and most terrifyingly, their role, once they had absorbed this information and got their feet under them, was to play devil's advocate, was to poke holes in all his favorite ideas, help him see around blind corners, never to get too comfortable in the ways of working or the way things have always been done. Their job was to be that other side of the coin so that he was never blindsided or there's this, once you become powerful or you've got a track record of incredible success, you can get into this trap of you and or everyone around you thinking that all your ideas are good and all your jokes are funny. Mm-hmm. And the Shadow was there to make sure that never happened. So I think systematizing ways in which you ensure debate, innovative, creative, thoughtful, dissenting opinions and thinking is core to both organization success.
How do you look for that attribute? How do you look for someone that's not going to be so impressed with an Eric Schmidt or a Jeff Bezos or Marissa Mayer that they're going to be awestruck, starstruck, and feel inhibited about voicing an opposing view? How do you look for someone that has the confidence to contradict?
Yeah, it takes guts, honestly. It's
Hmm.
not for everyone because it is easy to be awestruck because they are these seemingly incredible superhuman super performers.
Hmm.
But the when I was hiring teams, for example, during the almost decade that I worked for Eric, I hired very purposeful teams. When he transitioned from being CEO into being executive chairman, Google had never had a full time chairman before, and he'd never been a full time chairman before. And he didn't want it to be what was the trend then, which was kind of semi retirement. He wanted to 10x his output. And that's a very big job because he was one of the most effective CEOs in history. And I thought, okay, I need to build a machine behind him to empower him to do so. And so that's when I created the very first ever chief of staff role at Google and in tech in general, because I knew he needed that level of partnership. And I needed to hire a team that would empower us to be effective. So I used that bar of making sure that I was hiring people with a history of ambition, of grit, of perseverance, of resilience. I was looking for people who had a lot of struggle and hardship and moments of overcoming and betting on themselves and being good judges of character. One of my favorite interview questions when I was hiring anyone at Google, and I use it for my clients who are making really, really big bet hires now, was I liked to ask the question, tell me about a goal you set for yourself that took more than 1 year to accomplish. And by asking that question, it tells me so much about you as a person. First, what type of example do you have? Are you the kind of person who does that at all? Are you, in order to have accomplished that, you surely suffered setbacks, injuries, disappointments. You had to figure out a way to overcome that, gather around your own mentors, teach yourself new skills, et cetera, et cetera. So it tells me a lot about a person if they can do that. Someone who's been through that and consistently signs up, like they have a pattern of signing themselves up for that kind of struggle, is my kind of person. That's a person that isn't going to get starstruck. They are going to be able to speak their mind. They're going to be courageous to ask a seemingly stupid question or offer a crazy idea. And Jeff, when I was leaving Amazon after 3 years to start my PhD at Berkeley, he interviewed what felt like hundreds of people to potentially replace me, and he just rejected them all. And we were getting so close to the start of grad school, which I couldn't change, and I wanted time to kind of train my successor. And so I went back to him and I was like, look, Jeff, here's the top three. Would you reconsider any of these? And he looked at me and was like offended. And he was like, no. He said, I only hire people I have to hold back, not push forward. And
Mm.
that is my hiring mantra ever since.
Wow.
That
Yeah.
is the difference. As a leader, it's so exhausting to have to push that rock up a hill every day, let alone pull your team up with you. So you need people who are so ambitious, so eager, so passionate and mission aligned that you spend your energy channeling their best ideas rather than pulling ideas out of them.
What an amazing soundbite. I knew there was a
Mm.
reason why I got my best pen out and a new notepad before we started talking. Yeah, that's incredible. I love, 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 love that. And that question is brilliant. And I agree. I wrote that one down as well because you're right. You're absolutely right. There is the short term. I feel like it's like those who can motivate to do, a half a mile race, right? Like for the most part, anybody can kind of stomach it and muscle through, but it's the longevity. And that's why I think framing the question as you did with tell me about a goal that took longer than a year, because a year is where things like fatigue, discouragement, all of those things start to set in. They go, God, I just don't know if I have this in me. So that 1 year is a really important cliff, I think. So thank you for that. I love that question.
It's all yours. Use it at will. It is, yeah. If you are setting yourself up for that long term of a horizon, you're going to be humbled in the process. Just it's
Hmm.
inevitable. And I'm
Hmm.
thinking about I moved to Spain 5 years ago, and I'm still not great in Spanish. And being an effective and
Mm.
concise communicator is a big part of my self identity. And here, there's 5 year olds that speak in the past tense better than I do. I hate that. It never
Hmm.
feels good to me. But you
Hmm.
keep pushing through because it's important to me to
Right.
learn the language of where I'm living and the language of my husband's heart. So I will do
Yeah.
it. But
Right. And
It's
there you
hard.
are. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So you've said things in other interviews about how you really, you apply this idea of, instead of being a know-it-all, being a learn-it-all, right? And I think you've talked already in our discussion about that, about really engaging in the learning process, engaging in the process of discovery. How specifically did you do that in these roles, in terms of your own growth and really the way that you cultivated knowledge and extracted knowledge? I'm curious if it was purely through osmosis and observation and being in the room with these titans, or did you also directly engage them in your growth, and did they participate in your growth in a more direct way?
Yeah, this process evolved over time. And I want to give credit to, I often quote that, become a know it all or learn it all, not a know it all. I got that from Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft. When he took over, he had a real culture problem on his hands. I grew up in Redmond, Washington. My family moved there in 1985, the same year that Microsoft announced that as their global headquarters. So I grew up with this personal tech computing revolution happening literally outside my front door. And I watched Satya do what I thought was impossible, which was turn around an entire organization. There's this great story from the 90s in Microsoft. That was their ultimate heyday. They were, leading the charge in computing. And they were designing a new graphical user interface. And they had their UX UI designers do a usability study on it. Came back saying 6 out of 10 people find this graphical user interface confusing. And the lead engineer said, "Where did you find 6 idiots?" So that was the culture that he was inheriting. That's the perfect encapsulation of a know-it-all, right? I know better than you. I designed this. I'm smarter than you. Who are you to tell me it doesn't work? When really that's a design flaw. The people are telling you it doesn't work for them, and they are your users, and so they are right. So that was the biggest challenge that Satya had as he was taking over as CEO in an organization where he'd worked for 22 years. He was now managing his former peers. I can't imagine a harder burden than that, but he really did it incredibly successfully by really embedding this into the way that they run the organization today. I could go on and on about how much I admire that, but the ways in which I had this play out in my career, I would say in the beginning, rightfully, I had no idea what I was doing. So I did it very much through osmosis in the beginning. I had no choice but to become a learn-it-all because I sure as heck did not know anything when I started. I didn't know tech. Nobody really did, to be fair to me, but I didn't understand the vocabulary, all the acronyms, the people they were talking about, the technical details. I didn't have a PhD in anything technical, so it was overwhelming. So I literally, starting on the first day at Amazon, I had this notebook on the side of my desk where I would just write down everything that I didn't understand, which was a very long list. And I would just do my homework. I'd been a good student, so I treated it like school and I would do my research. This is pre-Google. So I had to do it the hard way of I needed to start following that reporter. I needed to start reading these books. I needed anything that someone quoted, I devoured. I read all the briefing documents. I asked my manager, John, the questions until my questions were good enough to ask in front of more senior people. And then I kind of baby stepped my way into asking clarifying questions live in a meeting. So that was the early stages. Then once I got to Google, and especially when I was with Eric, I started to take a much more proactive approach into him mentoring and giving me growth opportunities in a very purposeful and direct way. So in the foreword to my book, Bet on Yourself, Eric Schmidt wrote something incredibly kind, which about my working style and about all the spreadsheets that I have. But the part that really touched me the most was he outlines how I would come to him 12 months in advance and tell him something I wanted to learn or an opportunity I wanted to have. And I would say, here's how I assess my skills today. Here's what I think is lacking. X, Y, and Z ways that I could learn it. Can you give me permission to do that? And he would say yes. That's to his credit. But even though I've worked for probably inarguably some of the most effective visionary CEOs in the world, not once did they ever come to me and say, "Hey, Anne, I've been thinking about your interests and your capabilities and ways we could better utilize that." No, that's not their job. But when I did it, when I had clarity of you know what I want in return for my very hard work? I want to be in this particular network, or I want to have this skill. I want to learn to handle conflict like she does, or project manage like they do. And so I would look for opportunities where I could gain that skill. And I call this, looking back, it wasn't this clear to me at the time, but this is my win-win-win formula, where I first have to have a conversation with myself of what's a win? What do I want? I was, for decades not having anything that you could call work-life balance. I loved my work. So what did I want in exchange? So that conversation I have with myself. Then I would look for opportunities of like, how can Eric delegate something to me? Or how can I take something off his plate and give myself an opportunity to expand in that way that frees him up to be more effective in his zone of genius? And then if I could get those two things to align with what the organization needed most, you get a win every time. Not immediately. For example, when I was creating the role of chief of staff for the first time, it took me 3 years to make that official with HR. It took me about 6 months with Eric, and he could see exactly the benefits of it. And I could talk about my methodology on how I pitched that with him if that's interesting. But it took me 3 years to get it official through HR. And now not only is it pervasive across Google, but across all of tech, because this role can be so game changing for executives if you're partnered with someone who can offer, the full lens of support. So that's baby stepping through my career, how I made it happen. And then I, did the seemingly crazy thing where I was like, how would I be an entrepreneur? And I left all that and had to figure it out from zero, all again.
Right? Again, a pattern of consistently challenging oneself for long range goals. I mean, check, and check. Okay, so I owe you a giant thank you, because apparently we our debt of gratitude for coining the chief of staff role, terminology, title, all of it is yours. And so hats off to you, because that has been such a pivotal opportunity for so many. And we've seen this just incredible surge in the popularity, adoption, ubiquity of that role and function across startup, across tech, across venture capital. We even have, thanks to you, we even put together a course about how executive assistants can become chiefs of staff. And now I'm learning through our conversation that really we owe our debt of gratitude to you for having the campaign for that. So yes, I would love to hear that story about how you pitched it to Eric and how you ultimately got, over a 3-year time frame, you got adoption around that.
Yeah, this role is incredibly instrumental in executives being able to 10x their output. But I do want to acknowledge that while it is the most in demand role right now with all of my clients, with all of startup, when I'm at conferences, I was at South by Southwest just recently speaking there, this is the number one topic. But I want to acknowledge that it is also the most misunderstood, and I'm sure you know this just as well as I do, that the reason for that is that every chief of staff role is bespoke to the executive themselves, and it evolves over time. So even though I worked for Eric for 9.5 years, what he needed and demanded from me was different year over year. And so I had to constantly reinvent myself. So this one and done job description or this like checklist of things or skills, yeah, there's some commonalities, there's some core characteristics and skill sets for sure, but the adaptability of the role, I think, is what makes it, to me, the most exciting and to some the most terrifying. So the way I pitched it in the beginning to Eric was I needed to create what was this and how was it different from ways in which we were currently collaborating. So I saw a couple opportunities to develop a new skill set that was meaningful to me and to help free up more of his time. So tip number one is if you're trying to expand the confines of your current delegated authority level or job description, pitch it as an experiment. This is how I got him to say yes in the beginning. I said, Eric, what I'd like to try is over the next 6 months, I would like to see if you delegate your weekly meetings with your policy leads and comms leads. I think I can take that for you and bubble up only what needs a CEO approval or chairman approval. And that way we can free up 2 hours of your time, which, if you do the math, that's a lot of time and his time's expensive. I said, let's try it for 6 months and see if this leads to the right results. Then pro tip number 2 is outline the parameters so that they are not going to be nervous that it's going to go wildly out of control. So this is where you go back to my concept of green light indicators and red light indicators. I said, if this works, I expect that you will feel a huge relief that we can utilize those 2 hours a week for X, Y, and Z that, you've been charged by Larry and Sergey to do. I expect that your teams will be even happier because we won't have this bottleneck of decision making. They'll get rapid fire decisions from me without having to wait for your approval. And third, you're going to be more effective. You're going to be showing up in the right places, having the right conversations, and your time is consistently going to be prioritized accordingly because goodness knows in tech, nothing sleeps. And so I was reprioritizing not just day over day, but like hour by hour. So I said, those are my green lights. Here's my red lights. If you feel out of the loop, if you feel like the decisions I'm making on your behalf are inaccurate or uninformed, or I don't have the sophistication of the playbooks to be able to make these decisions, you're going to be ineffective. The team is going to be really unhappy for their limited access to you. And 3, we're not going to be fulfilling your responsibilities as chairman. So I said, and then I did weekly summaries. I came back to him with the reports. And of course, I didn't do everything perfectly in the beginning, but none of those red lights turned on. So that helped us know, okay, this is working. So that at the end of the 6 months, we evaluated what worked well, what could be improved, and then I expanded beyond those meetings. What else could I run? What else could be delegated to me? Which gave me access to new networks, new skill sets, new mentors and people who I could really learn and absorb from. And it also gave me an opportunity to delegate things that had been consuming my to-do list to other members of my team to similarly give them up-leveling opportunities. So we really created a win-win-win there.
It's amazing. Thank you for explaining and going through that. That is, I love that story. And I also love how it demonstrates that the onus and responsibility for your growth, your trajectory, what you get to touch and expose yourself to is on you. And, as you said, you never place the burden of responsibility for your growth and development and opportunities on your bosses. Quite the contrary, you took responsibility for how you wanted to grow and evolve and teed it up in such a way that it made sense to greenlight you in those ways. And I think that's a really important learning and takeaway for everyone, our listeners, and just the broader community, because I think that sometimes people tend to want to outsource that responsibility, and it's not appropriate, right? And I think that in really taking control of your destiny in that way and teeing things up in a way that makes it actually easy to collect those yeses and or easier, I should say, to collect those yeses and collect those opportunities, because you're framing it. You are taking responsibility for the thought process and the strategy. And I think that's essential. You can't burden people as high profile and as impacted with the responsibility for your own benefit.
Yeah, I think it's such a disservice that no one pulls you aside when you finish school and just explains that this is how, because that's how, up until the point where you enter the workforce full time, that's how it works, right? You do Algebra 101, then you do 201, 301, 401. There's a path. There's a chart of like, once I do this and I get this kind of score, then I'm qualified. So you kind of, at least I did, when I entered the workforce, I thought it would work like that. I've got this little job level. Maybe I'm in level 5. And if I do get a good review within 12 months, I'll be in L6. It doesn't work like that. Nobody told me that. So it took me a long time to be like, oh, I just need to raise my hand and invent opportunities to get this, to acquire the skills that are required at the next level. Like, okay, once that clicked and I had some success and also some huge failures, because when you do this, you are setting yourself up to live in a space outside your current expertise. So there is going to be a failure rate. And that is why you also have to outline the parameters of like, I'm watching closely. I'm not going to let this get out of control while I'm learning, but I'm going to figure out some new stuff. While of course you have to hit it out of the park in your core competencies. If they see kind of your core work failing, they're going to rein you right back in. So excelling in those core competencies, your KPIs, and then thinking, about these longer term horizon and giving yourself an opportunity to get outside that space is really rewarding and terrifying.
Yeah,
also.
And 100%, as most things are, right? It's that dichotomy of with great opportunity comes great risk. But I think that's essential, like learning to do that effectively. When you talk about betting on yourself, right? Learning to do that effectively, learning how to position oneself for opportunity and promotion is, I think, one of the most important things someone can do in accelerating and servicing their career. And yet, many people don't understand how to do it. And that's why I think revisiting that theme and that discussion of how to do it successfully, as you so clearly have demonstrated time and time again, is such a wonderful model and example for everyone. So talking about transitions, how did you arrive at this decision to transition from your executive assistant initial roots to chief of staff to ultimately the role that you are currently in, which is that of running your own leadership strategy consultancy?
Yeah, I tend to have this pattern where I get a little bit itchy about every 3 years or so. I get a little,
Isn't it
I'm
supposed to be
craving what's
7?
next. I know. I have no patience. I have no patience at all. I get really itchy for the next. There's actually computational models have proven that there's an ideal error rate in our lives that's really satisfying and primed for learning, and it turns out to be 15%. So it's actually 15.87 or something like that. So that means about 1 in 6 things you're doing during your day should be a little bit outside of your current expertise and capabilities. So when I find myself kind of living in that, it was easy. You get into this situation especially as an EA where you know all the answers. You're doing like X, Y, and Z over and over again, and you've perfected it. And, we tend to be type A's. We love to be perfect at stuff. But I can't stand it when most of my day is spent in that zone. So I'm always seeking out ways to shake that up. So that's how I progressed in my career, even, working for Eric for as long as I did. That's why every year the way I showed up and my responsibilities was very different than the way it had been the year before. And that's honestly how I made the gut-wrenching decision to leave Google after 12 years, a company I loved where my foxhole best friends for life were formed. It was a really emotionally devastating decision to leave, but I knew I had to do it because I looked for the last 2 years I was at Google. I really was focused on finding my next place. I knew that Eric would eventually retire, and I just saw myself kind of plateauing in my skills because I was so comfortable. And so I looked for another place within the organization where I could go to be stretched, and I made the very hard decision to leave and to get fully terrified again and reinvent myself because I knew I would be happier in the long run.
And tell us more about the work that you're doing now. Can you give us a representation of the types of coaching scenarios and issues that you specialize in? And I think the other piece to that question would be, who's a good candidate to work with you?
Yeah, so I started consulting fairly unintentionally. So I was, while I was working for Eric, he had a personal VC fund called Innovation Endeavors. And he would often tap me on the shoulder and ask me to kind of help out some of his portfolio CEOs as they were prepping for, something for the first time or advising them on something. And I loved it because as Google got bigger and bigger, I really craved that crazy, early, terrifying growth stages. And so I just found it wildly fun to just chat with them over coffee and see what they were inventing, what the future was going to look like. And so when I decided to leave, my intention was to take a break for a couple months since I hadn't slept in a few decades. And that did not work out because those same portfolio CEOs were like, hey, while you're figuring out, who you want to be next, I'd love to bring you in for this project or get your advice on this. And before I knew it, I had a full consulting roster and a waiting list. Now I've really honed it. At first, it was very scattershot. I didn't know what would be my best fit for my expertise and my experience, but now I know that I am best paired with CEOs of rapidly scaling organizations. These are orgs that have their product market fit. They're vying for that first pole position, or they're there now. It's their race to lose, and they're terrified that they will just miss their opportunity. They'll miss their greatest potential just because they don't know the playbooks or they haven't been around this, what for them is a blind corner, and I've been around this block many, many times. So I specialize in the particular challenges that come when scaling at that pace around people and operational systems. So right people, right seats who have a clear understanding of the parameters of their delegated authority level, the skill sets needed not only today, but also in the future from the organization, and then the systems that empower everyone to run as fast as possible within those zones of genius. That's easier said than done. This is what all of my clients those are the pain points they're feeling right now. And I find it wildly fun to help them discover their ways of working. Yes, I bring a lot of the best practices of things we've figured out in the playbooks that I've seen exist both at Amazon and Google and beyond. But I'm not there to kind of slap a Google process on something or a Jeff Bezos-ism on something. We're really there to, going back to the core of your question was, how did I use my past experiences in this consulting work? And I really see myself as just there to really ask the right questions, make unique observations. I have the benefit of looking at what they're doing from the other side of the fence. I'm not so close to it as they are. And so I just use that same methodology of what can we debate, what data will give us the indicators if this is the right bet to make, how can we frame this as a controlled experiment, how can we get the right people around the table with an understanding of the same definition of what success looks like. I use those same methodologies to help them, the CEOs, be their most effective selves.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, it's definitely a more, as you point out, it's a more bespoke solution, and
yeah,
there aren't one size fits all methods and strategies, but it's the modality that you learn, the practice of questioning and framing and packaging information, and it's that modality that you can really apply to new individuals going through new challenges. If you had to think about, kind of the one takeaway from Jeff Bezos, the one takeaway from Eric Schmidt, the one takeaway from Marissa Mayer, are there kind of core things that you feel you gleaned from them that you now have added to your toolbox or your toolkit?
This is the hardest part of our conversation because to do justice to that question, we would need hours. Because
I know.
To summarize what I learned.
Well, I have hours, Anne.
Let's go.
Let's go.
No, for all your listeners who want the full version of that, I highly recommend diving into my book.
Yeah.
But if I had to pick, let's see. Okay, I'll force myself to choose just a high level. I think I've shared my favorite thing about Jeff, which is around being very, very careful and mindful in curating the people who are around you. We've all heard that saying that we become like the 5 people that we spend most of our time with. So for executives, that's their team. It informs their decision making, their risk tolerance. It gives them the vision, the energy, the support that they need to do things that are really, really difficult. So Jeff is very famous for something he said back when I worked for him and has been repeated many times since, where he says, entrepreneurs, if you're doing anything creative and innovative, you have to be willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time. Being misunderstood is very uncomfortable. It is meaning like your parents think you're crazy. All the critics, all the expertise around you are saying that will never work. You're putting everything on the line for this idea and something that's not going to prove itself tomorrow. You're really lining stuff up for the long term. That's something I learned from him, and I'm eternally grateful because honestly, my nature is very timid, is very exacting, is perfectionist to every possible flaw within that word perfectionist, like all the negative. That was my nature. And he nurtured me out of that. He threw me squarely in the deep end of the ocean and into places I had no idea how to do. And he also gave me a team of people around me who were modeling that behavior. The executives he hired were also being tasked with things they had no idea how to do because they had never done it before, because no one had ever done it before. So I just watched them and just tried to learn as fast as possible and pivot and be honest. Jeff, he's an exacting guy. I mean, he's not the easiest boss, but he brings out the best in you. And as long as you're the first to tell him about your mistake and you only make that mistake once, you're good. So that's something I appreciate about him. Marissa, similarly, I really admire the way that she honed her teams. She's an incredible identifier of early stage talent. The hires that she made back then when I worked for her in 2006 through 2009 are literally running the tech world today. She was just batting it out of the park and identifying early stage talent. And I watched the way in which, because back then we were launching very important products at a really, really rapid pace. And she was very concerned, rightly, about burning out her team. And so she went to them and had these conversations one-on-one with all her direct reports. And she had a term for it I can't think of right now. But she would basically ask them, what do you need so that you don't resent your job? And for each of them, it was a different answer. For Johanna, it was, she had two small children at the time. She was like, I will resent my job if I always miss dinner. So Marissa would be the one to literally throw her out the door and make sure she was there for dinner and bath time with her kids. And then Johanna did not care about getting back online. And she was launching our Bangalore operation for the first time. She did not mind being on VCs at 3 a.m. She didn't resent her job for that, but she wanted that quality time with her kids at night. For another one of our engineers, he didn't want to miss his Friday night soccer match with his friends from Stanford. That was his non-negotiable. So you better believe he was out the door on a Friday night. So for each person, Marissa was really thoughtful about how can we fill them back up so that they can continue to give at this pace and this incredible heroic level. And that's a real art. I don't see many executives doing that early enough. Once somebody's already crashed and burned, they start asking those questions, and she did it preemptively, which I really admire. And she was a big defender of her people. Boy, did she go to bat for us in compensation and in opportunities. There was no question how much she cared about you as a human and as a teammate. And then Eric, among my favorite things about him is that his insatiable curiosity. Not only was he like a voracious reader, but he sought out unique experiences and unique people. Social scientists call these the weak ties. So we have people in our lives who are strong ties, like they have a lot in common with our background, our upbringing. Maybe we went to the same school, same religion, they kind of look like us, their families are similar to ours in structure or something. But the weak ties are where really interesting ideas and insights come from. These are people who have very little in common with you. For example, think about going to a sporting event. The person sitting next to you is supporting the same team, maybe enjoys the same sport that you do, but everything about their background, what they look like, where they come from, where they went to school, what their family's structure's like, could be wildly different from yours. You're gonna have a very different interaction with that person. Eric sought out those people very purposely. One of my favorite parts of my job was it was a huge percentage of my time was spent curating this list of people where he would just have interesting conversations with smart people whose expertise were different than his. And that makes life so rich. And that made him such an effective executive. And he was able to identify trends and needs and opportunities for tech decade before anyone else had made those similar observations, just because he sought out those unique voices. And that's something I reflect on constantly now, is like making sure I'm not getting in a rut. With social media algorithms the way that they are, we get fed a lot of people
right.
who are just like us.
Absolutely. And points of view that affirm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so you have to be very purposeful in cultivating a life that is diverse and interesting and nuanced. Because if you sit back and expect that to come to you proactively, you're going to be disappointed.
Yeah, it reminds me, we have a client, they're in the venture capital space, but they put on an annual conference every year, and it's about quote unquote thought piracy and this idea that, right? I think you would love it.
Yeah.
But it's this idea of let's get these really disparate people from completely opposite sides of the aisle to debate and discuss, knowing that the outcome is not agreement, the outcome is not, bringing someone to your point of view. The outcome is fostering healthy discourse. And the topics are wild. Like it's not necessarily business topics. It's all kinds of things, right? It's social, it's political, it's medical, it's bioethics, it's all of the things. But yeah, it's brilliant. That is the crux of also how they invest. So it makes sense. Yeah,
that's not by accident.
No,
yeah, and I would like
not
an
at all.
You
would
like
what?
An invitation. Yes.
Oh my gosh, I will gladly let them. I also want an invitation, Anne. So I can be your +1, or you can be my +1. I've been campaigning for 2 years. It's their second year is this year, so we'll see. Are you accepting new clients? Our listeners, I'm certain, have executives that they're listening to you going, gosh, my boss could really benefit from something like this. Are you accepting new clients? You mentioned a waiting list. Are you available for keynotes and other speaking engagements?
Yeah. So because what I do is so bespoke, I only take a handful of clients at a time. And I start with 90-day sprint contracts. So my client list tends to fill up a quarter in advance. But with that said, tech is unpredictable. So occasionally spots open up. But it's most important to me to make sure that my expertise and my business approach matches their goals and their needs at the moment. So some people contact me when it's a little bit too early, or maybe it's a little too late, and I send them off to other experts. But I always welcome a conversation to see if I can be helpful. But yeah, it's very, very bespoke and very time consuming. I made the mistake when I started of having like 15 clients at a time and almost died. But now I take between 6 and 10 at the most. So it takes a while. But I love the way it's structured, so I welcome that. The other thing I offer, which is more accessible, more available, is I do leadership offsites. I'm about to do that for a client in Iowa, actually, where I'm coming in and getting embedded with his executive team, and we're doing like a leadership retreat. He's a new CEO. He's been in the organization for a long time, but just now was chosen as the successor CEO. And so we're doing kind of a strategy reset and really optimizing. So I love coming into teams and doing those kind of bespoke up levelings. And then, yes, the third thing I do is I do public speaking. So I speak at industry events, in teams. I've done events inside, Google, Meta, Netflix, everybody. And it's among my favorite things to do because it's just rapid fire best practices I could possibly get out of my head, told through wildly interesting stories of the foundation of the internet that you won't hear anywhere else. So that's among my favorite way to spend my time. So those are the three offerings I have. I think my job is just insanely fun.
Yes, I love it. I love it, love it, love it. I have a final question for you, which is what we ask of all of our guests. If you could have supported anyone throughout the course of history, who would you choose to support and why? And you've already gotten 3 of the best, but
I have.
I mean, really, like you hit the jackpot not once, but 3 times. But that being said, if there's anyone left on your hit list, we'd love to know.
It's hard. So this is something that people used to ask me at Google all the time is like, where on earth are you going to go from here? Yeah. And one of my answers back then was I would have really loved to work with Barack Obama. And I'm particularly tuned into that one because one of my dear friends was his body man and right-hand man for 8 years as senator through the campaign and then in the White House. And boy, was that a wild ride. Super interesting. So I think that would have been fun. But I'm going to cheat and can I choose myself? I think that's what I'm doing right now.
Totally. You are. Absolutely.
I am a big believer in us championing ourselves and giving us as the same support and attention to detail and anticipation of needs that we would give to an exec that we're partnering. So I try and do that for myself. I often fail, like daily basis fail. Just this morning, I had a panic voice exchange with my best friend, where both of us who are both CEOs of small companies, we're just like, I can't, I'm overwhelmed today. And then we had our moment and we moved on with our day. So what I would like to do is do it for myself at the quality and the care and with the anticipation of needs and with that kind of same eye to growth and strategy and sustained butt kicking. I want to do that for myself. So that's what I'm working on now.
You mean bet on yourself, Anne?
Yeah. Thank you.
Touche. Yeah. I mean, what a perfect way to close out. But that really is. I mean, that is the story. That is the crux of it. And I really encourage our listeners to obtain a copy of your book if they're not already in possession of one. But I love that. That's a wonderful takeaway. And wow, I'm so riveted by our conversation. I can't thank you enough for being here and being a part of this conversation. I know this is already going to be one of my favorite episodes. And interestingly, you mentioned the Obamas. I would say one of my other favorite episodes is we had China Clayton on, who notably supported, Mrs. Obama for 12 years. And I think that the two of you, so are you acquainted with each other?
We have been introduced, but we've never met. So we have a mutual friend, Lucy Brazier, who, is connecting us.
I think the two of you would be fast friends. And just wonderful stories. Hers was also just a wonderful story. But I've learned so much from today. I have a cramp in my left hand from all of the notes that I took. But thank you again. This has just been wonderful. Can't thank you enough.
Thanks for having me.
Reach is brought to you by Maven Recruiting Group, who specializes in placing executive assistants and support staff to the Bay Area's most prominent executives and companies. If you've enjoyed being part of our podcast community and are interested in becoming part of our candidate community, we're currently hiring for roles in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and Los Angeles. You can visit us at www.mavenrec.com to see some of the roles we're currently working on and to submit your resume.